Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome. My name is Amy Janess. I am programming coordinator for the Nantucket Atheneum Public Library on the island of Nantucket. Thank you for coming. Just wanted to point out a couple of things about how the evening will roll. We're going to have about 45 minutes of discussion and about 15-20 minutes of questions at the end. If you roll your mouse over the bottom of your screen, you'll see a whole bunch of icons pop up, and one of them is Q&A. And if you type your question in the Q&A at any point, we will keep track of them, and then we will start addressing them at the end. So I encourage you, if you think of a question, put it in the Q&A. If someone else has already asked your question, you can make it go up to the top of the pile by liking it. So feel free to do that. And also use the chat function, just if you have a question, but not a question for Peter and Susan, but just a question for us. And I just want to welcome tonight's speakers. Peter Baker is a chief White House correspondent for the New York Times. Susan Glasser is the former editor-in-chief of Foreign Policy Magazine, the founding editor of Politico Magazine, and currently a columnist for The New Yorker. And Peter Panchy taught history at Nantucket High for 28 years, and for the last 3 years, he's been leading conversations at the library about democracy and politics and the three branches of government. So I'm really looking forward to tonight's discussion, and take it away.
I'll start it off by saying I had the privilege of starting to review this book, and it's a fascinating study of James Baker III, the man who ran Washington. So I want to compliment you on a wonderful book. And my first question is, although it seems a little redundant, it's a fascinating story. But in your prologue, you say you worked on this for over 7 years. And I wondered what you were thinking of. What spurred you to want to do this in-depth study of James Baker?
Right. Well, listen, first of all, Amy and Peter and everybody with the Atheneum, thank you very much for having us. We are delighted to be with you tonight. We're sorry not to be more in person. We've been lucky to attend and even participate in a few of the Atheneum lectures over the years, and they've always been one of the real highlights of our summer, which we always spend at least some in Nantucket. So it's we're sorry not to be in person, but thank you very much for having us. The Baker book was really a challenge and a fascinating venture for us because his life touched so many important moments in our history, in our own modern American history, really from the end of the Watergate to the end of the Cold War. That sort of period of around 25 years or so, every major thing that happened in Washington and even around the world to some extent had Baker's fingerprints on it. He has some role in it. And so to tell his story, to tell our story as a country and in Washington in particular, how things have changed so much. So I think that was one of the things that really made it compelling to us.
Well, that's right. Thank you, Peter. And Peter, I should say this is great for us because it's sort of a sneak preview of our book tour. The book, The Man Who Ran Washington, was supposed to be out in May, but due to the coronavirus, as we say, it's put off till the end of September. So in many ways, we are delighted to be able to sort of, have this be our kind of first real book conversation about it. I think you can already pre-order the book, but you can't get it until the end of September.
Please pre-order the book.
Yes, pre-order the book. But the reason I bring that up is because the context has shifted so much since we began the project. And that's really kind of the interesting part of this answer. Baker would be a fascinating character, I think, for anyone, given the role that he played in sort of shaping an era in our politics of Washington from the end of Watergate, as Peter said, to the end of the Cold War. But the truth is that we started writing this at a very different political moment. The dysfunction and gridlock was certainly already apparent in the post-2008 crisis in the Obama era. But it took on a different reality, I think, for us and also for Baker himself, watching him wrestle with the rise of Donald Trump and the disruption of the Republican Party that he felt that he had done, Baker felt that he had done so much to create, was really is sort of the backdrop for this story, which, in many ways, we found that Jim Baker is kind of the un-Trump. And yet he had a fascinating process of not really being able to renounce essentially this hostile takeover of the party by Trump. And also, of course, Trump, who had such an animus and has done so much to attack the Bush family, without whom Jim Baker never would have left Houston, Texas.
To follow up on your comment about the un-Trump, that comes through very strongly in the book, even though Trump only appears occasionally. Baker being a doer, a builder, a man who seeks common ground to negotiate a way to move forward. And I think it's almost implied that Trump's strength is more, destroyer is too strong a word, but he certainly is undermining many of our institutions and has brought the dysfunction of government to even an unperceived level now. Would you like to talk about that contrast?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think Trump is a disruptor, right? He is a force from the outside coming in like a bull through a china shop, rampaging through, and he doesn't care what the rules used to be. He doesn't care what the norms are. Just because it's the way it's always been done has no meaning to him. And that's one of the things that makes him appealing to the people who do like him, is that they want the system shaken up. In some ways, Baker's era, is the source of the consternation to the people who end up supporting Trump, because they want the system broken up, and nobody represents the system in effect more than Baker. But it's a fascinating thing, because Baker did believe in building things. He helped build an international system of alliances and free trade and relationships that we see, on bended knee these days, or very, very much stressed. He built, a Republican Party that, on the backs of Reagan's popularity and then Bush's successes in foreign policy, that had some stature in the world. He built his own reputation. He was a man who, of course, was interested in his own success as well as everybody else's. And I think that as White House Chief of Staff, as Secretary of the Treasury, and as Secretary of State, he established himself as one of the primary movers and shakers of our era. But the difference was, he didn't believe in conflict for the sake of conflict. He could be ruthlessly partisan during election times. That was his job, as he saw it. He ran 5 presidential campaigns. Think about that, 5 presidential campaigns, right? And asked Michael Dukakis or Al Gore if they thought Jim Baker was some sort of a squishy, soft guy. They didn't. But once the election was over, he believed in actually sitting down and getting something done. As you say, he was a doer. So he would sit down with the Democrats and work out deals on Social Security, on the tax code, on the Contra war, on all sorts of things, because he felt like, what was the point of acquiring power if you didn't use it to do something? And what we see right now, I think, is more of a disruption rather than a construction. We're not really sure what the point of the acquisition of power is for, other than to rip up what had been before.
Well, and personal aggrandizement. There is a big difference in terms of an ideology that's focused on yourself. Baker, interestingly, one of the reasons I think we called him, the un-Trump, was actually he was fundamentally a deeply conservative in the old-fashioned sense of the word, not necessarily ideologically conservative, but in terms of caution and focusing on working with the institutions that exist and shoring them up. That was something that both Bush and George H.W. Bush and Baker, characterized their approach to the world at a time when actually the wheels were sort of coming off, especially, 1989 to 1991, this dramatic period of global disruption The difference now is that the US is the disruptor, and that Donald Trump is interested in blowing up a world order at which the US is in the center. Perhaps we don't wield the unchallenged power that we have at times since the end of the Cold War, but essentially we now have this, I think, almost unique moment in geopolitics where the beneficiary of the world's power systems is essentially attacking it from that privileged position. And so that is almost the inverse of the world that Baker founded. But he came from profoundly conservative world of, Houston lawyers who helped to build the city over several generations, and the state, in fact, who were deeply distrustful of politics at all. And I think one of the other things that Peter and I see every day, and I'm sure anyone who's listening to this as an observer, as a citizen in the United States, you see it as well, is that fundamentally the incentive structures in Washington and in our national politics have just changed so radically. And so Jim Baker was really, really good at making deals, including with Democrats and working across the aisle. But that's also because if you wanted to succeed, and he wanted to succeed, and he was a fiercely competitive player, the road to success, it led through actually doing something. And right now, look at what's happened where our Congress has just gone home rather than do something in the middle of the coronavirus pandemic.
Yeah, I totally agree with what you're saying, and it's a very, very interesting contrast. I was surprised, and I do think I'd love to hear your comments on the state of party power today. But I was surprised when I thought you portrayed Baker having a realistic view of the downside of Donald Trump, yet admitting in 2016 he voted for him because he felt even with his downsides, and I don't think he could have imagined the damage that Trump would do internationally. But even with his downsides, it was more important for the Republican Party to have the power of the presidency. And that sense of power is more important, I think, is one of our big problems in our government today.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that Baker, in some ways, is a parable for the modern Republican Party as it struggled to figure out what to do about Trump. They don't like him, most of them. They don't agree with him mostly on these things. I mean, Trump has upended orthodoxy of the Republican Party going back years in terms of the big spending and deficits, in terms of free trade, in terms of suspicion of Russia, in terms of internationalism and NATO and alliances. All of these things that that Republicans had once stood for, Trump has thrown, come in with a very different view, and many Republicans are swallowing it, not because they agree with it, not because they like him, not because they even respect him, but because they feel like they have to either be loyal to the party, or they're afraid of him, or they just can't. They see only one path forward. He controls the Republican Party probably more than any president has controlled his party in our lifetime. I mean, there's dissent is not allowed, and Baker sort of represents.
Although amazingly enough, that tells you something fundamental about Baker as our subject as well, and his character, because what does he have to be afraid of? He's just turned 90 years old. He's been in, he still works at Baker Botts Law Firm, founded by his family, among others, a few generations ago. But, basically he sort of retired from politics, certainly. And yet we found him wrestling with this in a way that I think does speak to the profound nature of how much partisanship has become one of the most important identifiers today. The other thing that it struck us in terms of Baker as a character, what did we learn from watching him struggle with Trump? Because you would think from the outside, and we thought this originally, that it would be a no-brainer for Jim Baker just to say, well, of course I'm not voting for him. Look at how he's talked about the Bushes, and they aren't voting for him, and neither am I. And I think what I came to realize are two things. Number one, he has a fundamental view of Washington and how it works, and he understands that you sacrifice everything by being on the outside, and as he would put it, pissing in. And, that unless you're on the inside, in fact, you have no hope of really influencing the course of things. So I think that's an insight about him and his view of Washington. And then the other thing I'll say is I went to see him for one of the many interviews we did for the book that just happened to be just a few days before the 2016 election. And we'd been talking with him throughout, but I sat there in this hotel suite with him at the Willard Hotel, just a few blocks from the White House. And he was just a man in such pain and such discomfort. Everyone in his life who are, diehard Republicans, his wife, his daughters, they clearly were working him hard, begging him not to vote for Donald Trump. He'd already decided not to endorse Trump or, publicly support him. And he told me at the beginning, well, I don't know. And he said, I think I'm going to vote for him for this reason, that I know how things will turn out with Hillary Clinton, but I can hope for the better with Trump. And I came back to it at the end. We had a long interview about his history and came back to it. And I said, but I just can't see Jim Baker voting for Donald Trump. And he looked in such agony and he said to me, well, Susan, I haven't voted for him yet. But he did.
And he probably will again this fall.
Well,
he has not. He has not.
Well,
said.
I'd like to believe that now that he's seen more, maybe he won't. Maybe that there is to
tell us at one point that he was considering voting for Joe Biden before Biden had the nomination.
Yeah.
But then he later told Peter, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
Well, it'd be interesting if you can have that conversation. You mentioned how I think at one point in the book you talk about campaigns are blood sport. And yeah, Baker always reached out, whether it was to Tip O'Neill or other people going across the aisle again, find that common ground, get something done. In my opinion, I guess I'd attribute it somewhat to Gingrich, who switched it from blood sport to irrevocable enemy, that we're right, you're wrong. It's about getting more who agree with me, and that's how we're going to run government. Comments on that? Do you see that as a shift at that time, or you probably have more nuanced understanding than I do?
I think that's right.
I do. And by the way, it's not a mistake that Newt Gingrich has reemerged as an advisor and counselor and confidant of Donald Trump. I was covering Congress in the late 1980s and early 1990s when I graduated from college, and Gingrich was essentially cementing his power base, which involved destroying the old Republican Party that actually Jim Baker had made deals with. And many of Gingrich's enemies were in effect Baker's enemies of the Reagan era. And why? Because it was a vision about making deals with the other side is suspect. And of course, many people think that's the reason that Jim Baker's best friend and his old tennis partner from Houston lost re-election. In part, it was because of the his own party not supporting him and viewing him as a traitorous sellout in making a budget deal with Democrats in what would turn out to be his only term in office. So I do think there's something to that, and the scorched earth politics of today, which it's easier not to make a deal in many ways and to please your voters than it is to try to govern or even campaign from the center anymore.
It used to be there's kind of an incentive structure to have bipartisanship, right? At least in the governing part of things. If you had a bill and you wanted to get some attention, you would find a co-sponsor on the other side of the aisle, and you would get together and hold up hands, say, hey, here we go, bipartisan legislation, this is great. And their incentive, you would be rewarded for that by the political system. Today, it's the other way around. Today, if you do that, you're a sellout, you're caving in, and you might, in fact, even generate a primary contest, which is more of a threat to today's Congress members in the House, at least, than a threat from the other party because of the way these districts have been drawn.
Now, of course, Donald Trump, he didn't invent this phenomenon. This polarization has been going on for a long time. But the one point I do want to make, though, is that by having a president who's uniquely positioned to divide, and in fact, that's really his only mode of operating politically, that has taken a pre-existing trend and made it actually impossible. Like maybe before, these members of Congress felt that it was politically inadvantageous for them to deal with the other side. But now in the Trump era, where there have been so many outrages and actual norm crossing and actual violations of what we would consider to be the rule of law system, now it's actually impossible. It's like become a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah, and very often the response seems more like theater than government. You're putting on a performance for your base rather than try to get something done or move forward.
Yeah, they'd rather have the issue than the success in a lot of cases.
One of the facts in your books that surprised and actually delighted me was Trump calling when Bush got the nomination and offering to be the vice presidential candidate. Have you got any more to say about that? I had to just, I'm sure I smiled and snorted, but I didn't realize he was active in that way back in '88.
You weren't the only one who smiled and snorted. So did Jim Baker and George Bush. They thought this was kind of nuts. They didn't, what on earth? Who, this guy, this flashy New York billionaire who's in the gossip columns all the time. They didn't take it seriously. And I don't think anybody probably in that era quite realized just how far that ambition would take him. But Donald Trump did have early ambition to the big public stage. And he did offer himself as a candidate in 1988. Of course, he would later run. Before he ran in 2016, he ran as a candidate in 2000. People forget that, as a Reform Party candidate before he bailed out. So yeah, he's gone back for a while thinking of himself as a possible president.
Yeah. I'm surprised they didn't offer to be co-president rather than vice president.
I thought, yeah.
By the way, the other job that Donald Trump thought he would be really good at was that of nuclear negotiator. And he had a long-standing fascination both with Russia / the Soviet Union and also with nuclear weapons. And he also raised his hand in that era and suggested that he would be really good at negotiating new nuclear arms deal with the Soviets, an offer that was also not taken up.
I would love it. You both are so well versed in Russia. And if I remember correctly, I think Jim Baker said that he didn't feel that we fulfilled the spirit of our agreement with Russia during kind of the devolvement of the USSR, and how either you or he felt that opened the road to Putin down the road. Any comments on Russia, enlightening us about Russia then and now, related to that big change, that monumental end to the Cold War, and where we are now?
Yeah.
Well, so one of the sort of Baker's signature achievement really as Secretary of State came in this period when basically the Soviet Union was falling apart and their Eastern Empire was falling apart, and then came the fall of the Berlin Wall, right? And nobody expected it. I mean, people dreamed of the reunification of Germany, but they didn't think it was going to happen that year. And nonetheless, after November 1989, not only did it happen, but it happened pretty quickly. And Baker was sort of the chief negotiator, bringing the various parties together in this process. As part of that, there was a huge negotiation with Mikhail Gorbachev, who was then the leader of the Soviet Union. And the issue is a new reunified Germany going to stay anchored in the West? Is it going to be part of NATO? What happens to East Germany? What happens to all those troops there? At one point, Baker had a meeting with Gorbachev and said that troops would not be moved 1 inch eastward. And ever since, this has become sort of the origin of Vladimir Putin's grievance narrative about how somehow, the West took advantage of Russia and, betrayed it in this deal. Now, there were then months and months and months of subsequent negotiations, and none of this was ever agreed to in any formal sense. And in fact, actually, Gorbachev, as the book recounts, had a famous moment in Washington where he essentially caved, much to the horror and dismay, by the way, of the Soviet generals with their big medals, who were sitting at the table around him and practically, had heart attacks sitting there, in which he agreed that the new reunified Germany could join NATO. And then obviously the years of expansion of NATO that came afterwards came long after Baker and Bush were gone from the scene during the Clinton administration and during George W. Bush's administration.
I would love to see Baker at his prime sit down at a table with Vladimir Putin.
Yeah.
That would be fascinating, right? Because in fact, they had people in Gorbachev and then later Yeltsin who wanted to be friends with the United States, right? So they're pushing on an open door to some extent. But they handled it masterfully, partly because Baker tried to understand what was it the other guy needed. He understood the other guy's politics and said, I know how far I can push him and where that line is, I can't push him beyond. And I know what I need to get and how I can get it by giving him something he needs. That's a skill set that's not valued anymore and hasn't been valued to some extent in Washington for a while. And I don't know that Baker would have made a difference with Putin, but he dealt with some pretty tough characters when he was as Secretary of State, including Hafez al-Assad, who was the brutal leader of Syria at the time. He had, session after session with him trying to negotiate a Middle East peace conference, which he did successfully negotiate. And I would pay money to see Baker go up against Putin and see how that played out.
I agree. I thought it was, I don't know the right word, when Baker kind of rused the fact that we can't have a Marshall Plan for Eastern Europe and Russia, that we could spend trillions of dollars without thinking on the Cold War, but that he felt the American people and our politics could not support $100 billion for peace.
Right. And look, in fairness to them, the Soviet Union at that point was kind of a corrupt whole. And there was some view that you sent money there, it was simply going to disappear and you never see it again. But there was a moment where we didn't fully solidify Russia's place in the West. We didn't anchor them in the West in a way that would be sustained. Now, maybe we couldn't have. Maybe it was beyond our control. Russia has to do it itself. It's not our, country. But the 90s, and we went there in 2000, right, when Putin was first coming into power, the 90s was perceived by Russians as a period of chaos, a period of upheaval. Their life savings had disappeared. The politics were crazy. And so they associate the word democracy, which we revere, with catastrophe, right? And so when Putin gets up and says that the breakup of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, it resonates with Russians who saw the 90s not as a bold venture into democracy, but as a failed experiment.
Although I must say, you also have to recognize that a lot of this is a narrative that Putin and those who supported him, have created. In fact, I just want to be clear with people that, in fact, the sort of corrupt oligarchy that has followed the Yeltsin era is fundamentally a less democratic one. And there were faltering and flawed, but nonetheless actual democratic institutions that started to emerge, especially freedom of speech in Russia during the 1990s. Essentially, the system has become even more corrupt, but simply more integrated with the actual functioning of the government and the Kremlin itself in the period of Putin's rule. And so, it's been very useful to have the United States and the West as a foil for Vladimir Putin and sort of an external enemy. I think that Baker, what you're pointing out when he says, well, we couldn't have gotten a kind of Marshall Plan for the Soviet Union passed. He's a ruthless pragmatist and realist when it came to assessing the politics of something and what was possible. And, that was to his credit. And also, by the way, he had many detractors because what it meant was he wouldn't take on a loser. even if the ideologues inside the Bush administration or the Reagan administration wanted to do something that was worthwhile, if Jim Baker thought it wasn't going to fly, there are two things you should know about it. Number one, he was probably correct. And then number two, that it was going to piss a lot of people off when he said, I'm not touching this with a 10-foot pole. And he had a unique gift, as many survivors in Washington do, of somehow being nowhere near the mess when the inevitable debacle would ensue. But he was a real pragmatist, and that meant that he didn't want to touch causes that he couldn't win, even if it was the right thing to do.
Yeah. I was just amazed at in those 3 years when he was Secretary of State. It seemed, as I thought back, as I read, I said, did this really all happen? It was like, I'm sure this happened over 12 years. I couldn't imagine, like, he's involved with dealing with Gorbachev and the devolving USSR, and he gets the phone call about Tiananmen Square. And it was like, you gotta be kidding me. Any comments on that, and also China at this point?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. It is 3 years of the most tumultuous events we've seen in the international world for maybe in our lifetime, because you had, as you point out, first of all, he had to solve the Contra war because that had dominated and sucked the life out of Reagan's administration. He came in with Bush and said, we're not going to let that, become our white whale. So we got that off the table, solved that issue. You had the unification of Germany, which is an extraordinary thing that required very delicate diplomacy, because Britain and France were almost as skeptical about it as the Soviet Union was at that point. They were our friends. You had the Iraq war, the invasion of Kuwait and the Gulf War to expel them from that. You had the Madrid Peace Conference. You had the fall of Soviet Union, the coup against Gorbachev. Remember that when he was locked up in Crimea. All these things, boom, boom, boom. And then at the very end, the Yugoslavia war and probably other things we didn't even get to because it was just so eventful. And I think that in a way, that's what makes the story so compelling, because, they were doing so much of this on the fly and yet trying to stay ahead of this wave as it was cresting over the world.
Well, you made the point about China and Tiananmen Square. And, really that happened in June of 1989. And the Berlin Wall fell in November of 1989. And, we have tended, maybe we're Americans, we're, optimists, or we used to be up until recently by nature. So we've tended to look at 1989 as this incredible story about freedom ringing, right? And that, Bush and Baker and the unraveling of the Soviet Union and the captive nations of Eastern Europe, the Baltics, were finally set free. And so our narrative has been about freedom. And I remember I was, heading into my senior year in college at the time. You could look back on it and think this was the year of miracles. This was, as someone said to me recently, 1989 was arguably the best year of our lives, but we just didn't know it yet, in a geopolitical sense. And yet, June of 1989 was also the alternate path chosen by China. And it was the crackdown in Tiananmen Square, which Jim Baker, to the point about not really wanting to touch a loser, was pretty content to have George H.W. Bush, because the former president had been the U.S. envoy to Beijing, and Brent Scowcroft was the one who just passed away this week, National Security Advisor. It was Scowcroft and not Baker who did what a lot of people would think is the dirty work of flying secretly to Beijing only months after this crackdown, essentially to assure the Chinese that we would restore relations and that we wouldn't hold it against them forever, despite the talk of human rights in Congress. And so, you can look at it as this great year when freedom rang in Eastern Europe, or you can look at it, and that I think is equally valid, although it has gotten less attention until recently. You can look at it as the year that China said, you know what? The Communist Party leadership is determined to maintain its hold on power, and we're not going to make the mistake of Mikhail Gorbachev, and we're not going to engage in any kind of foolhardy political reforms. We will focus on economic reforms to save our system, and we will keep the reins of power tight. And the Chinese Communist Party is still in power today.
Well, earlier, again, in this jam-packed 3 years, mentioned Iran-Contra, which was certainly one of those things where Baker's radar about how to stay away from something that could blow up and discredit you, if you want to talk about that. But also, especially since Poindexter and not North, maybe McFarlane reappear in the George W. Bush administration. What do you think of Iran-Contra as laying groundwork for the expansion of executive power?
Yeah, that's an interesting story. That's a great point too. I think you're right about his sort of instincts for trouble, right? So in the very first days of the Reagan White House, when he's taking over as chief of staff, he sits down with Michael Deaver. And Michael Deaver tells a story, he's now passed away. He tells a story in an oral history. It's very evocative. He says, we're sitting so close, he said, our knees were almost touching. And he said, Baker says to me, your job and my job is to keep us from getting into war in Central America. From the very start, he saw the hardliners in the Reagan White House as being determined to stop the Soviet intervention in Nicaragua and El Salvador and so forth in a way that was dangerous in Baker's mind to the Reagan administration. And he, in fact, did, object to what he saw as excesses down in Central America. And so the Iran-Contra thing happens after he leaves as White House chief of staff and moves over to the Treasury Department. And what Michael Deaver says, and other people have said this too, is had Baker remained as White House chief of staff, Iran-Contra would never have happened. He would never have allowed that to go forward. His instinct for trouble is very high. But you're right. I mean, Iran-Contra did sort of enhance the power of the presidency to sort of ignore the will of Congress. We're seeing a little of that today on some level, right? Where does the congressional power end and the presidential power begin? Reagan's aides took it upon themselves to conduct foreign policy in a way that the Congress has said you're not allowed to, is against the law with the Boland Amendment. And I think we're still struggling with that. And that was one of the era when Dick Cheney came in. He was one of the Intelligence Committee members who looked at Iran-Contra and said, "Hey, nothing wrong here. The Congress has no business telling the administration what to do." And he became vice president, of course, and asserted more executive power when he was in office. So we're still seeing that. I think the after effects of the 1980s even today playing out.
Well, and by the way, actually, there was a famous meeting of the national security principals in the Reagan first term in which they were discussing this. Baker was not present, but he was invoked, and he was quoted at this meeting, which a transcript of which later emerged, saying it would be an impeachable offense were the president to bypass the will of Congress in this way, which of course is then ultimately what happened. Now, interestingly, essentially, the American people let off Reagan because it was never conclusive about how read into the scheme he was or how purposefully, he himself was engaged. It was clear that his administration had been involved in a very specific scheme to subvert, not just the will of Congress, but the actual law. When flash forward, here we are in 2020, because of coronavirus, we forget the president of the United States was impeached, although he was then not convicted for not only subverting the will of Congress, but actually holding hostage nearly $400 million worth of congressionally appropriated military aid to Ukraine on his own personal behalf. It was a scheme that everyone agrees, to the extent they agree it existed, that actually originated with the president himself and in the Oval Office. So in many ways, you see the distance from Reagan to Trump and the difference between those two stories.
I'm sad to say we're approaching the end of my time to talk with you, and I'm really sad about that. I have one last question. One of James Baker III's greatest strength was his relationship with the press. And yet now we're dealing with they're the enemy of the people, fake news. Some last comments on that topic, if you will.
Yeah, it's so we didn't cover Baker when he was in office. We got to know him after he left office, and we certainly got to know him during these 7 years of researching it. So we got to see up close how he does it. There's no question his technique ought to be studied anyway by Democrats and Republicans. He came out and says, look, yeah, I think the press is generally liberal. I think most reporters are probably liberal, but I think I can work with them. I think I can, manage their stories. I can give them, he understood how to feed reporters information that made them write stories that were, if not favorable to him, at least not damaging to him. He understood that it was important to engage, not to vilify. He had a policy. There was, any reporter who called him that day, he would get back to you that day. And if he couldn't, he made sure Margaret Tutwiler, his number one person, did. Sometimes you'd hear around in the White House around 6:15 p.m., just a few minutes before the evening news is about to go on. And, Margaret would pop her head in the office and say, hey, Sam Donaldson is about to go on the air on ABC. Do you have anything for him? And Baker would think of something quick to feed him because it would control the narrative. And it was in his interest to do so. He didn't treat the enemy. He didn't treat the press as the enemy. He understood that they weren't his friend necessarily at all times, and that there might be stories he didn't like. So we saw this during our research process. I was really very struck by the fact we sat down at the beginning of this and said, look, this is not an authorized biography. You do not have the right to determine how we're going to write it. We're having this agreement here. And he says, look, that's fine. I'm going to open up my archives to you. I've never opened them up to anybody before. I'm going to sit and talk to you as much as you want to talk to me. Basically, it's going to all be on the record and you can use any of it. And okay. And I thought okay, he's saying that at the front end, but at some point along the way, we're going to get into a fight because you always do. He'll argue about this or argue about that. He never did. He basically, he felt very comfortable with his story, even to the point where there were negative things about him. Not only did he own up to it, he sometimes even volunteered them. There's this one story, but there's one story I heard from somebody in Houston saying, well, did you ever hear about how he punished the Houston Chronicle, which was a paper there, right? So he ran for state attorney general, people forget this, in Texas in 1978. His hometown paper, the Houston Chronicle, built on land that his own family helped provide to them, endorsed the other guy. Never forgot it. Really angry for years about it. 10 years later, he's Secretary of the Treasury, and he managed to create basically finagle a provision that forced the ownership of the Houston Chronicle to sell. And I heard this story, I said, wow, I better ask him about that, but I'll wait till the end of this interview so he doesn't kick me out of the office. At the end of the interview, I said, sir, you remember how you told me you were mad at the Houston Chronicle? Yeah, he says, did I tell you how I got back at them? And then he just volunteered the story without my even asking about it. See, not only was he not, he probably should have been more ashamed of it. Maybe he understood that it wasn't looking good, but I was struck that he was willing to talk about his stories, even ones that didn't necessarily make him look good, and tell it on his own terms.
Did you want to add anything, Susan?
It's an extraordinary thing to be in Washington today, or to be observing it as everybody here is. And, I think a lot of what we're trying to do is to figure out, well, what is truly unique and remarkable about this moment in time, and about this presidency versus all that preceded it. And, the press, having the press be called the enemies of the people. When we lived in Russia, that's the term that Joseph Stalin used to condemn millions of people to the gulag and to death. Vrag naroda. Donald Trump knows that. It's fundamentally just the most un-American thing to say about journalists. And, I think working with Baker, studying what he did, how he did it, it doesn't give you a sort of rose-colored glasses view of politics. Politics is, it ain't beanbag, as they say, in Washington or London or any other world capital, right? These are fiercely competitive folks who are there to win, not to be your friend. This is a study, in fact, in a particularly calculating and cold-blooded man. This wasn't a guy who was buddy-buddy. Even people worked with him for years, and he never invited them to his home. But what we found is not that he was the friend of the press corps, but that, politics is broken down. And when the information flow breaks down, and you're not even able to communicate, we've moved into a more ideological and charged era in which there's a war on facts itself. And I think that's the difference. So to me, it was a reminder of whether it's a Republican or a Democrat, how a functioning, open, representative democracy is supposed to work and how it doesn't right now.
I couldn't agree more. And I think back to the Peter Zenger case, decades before the American Revolution,
That's right.
where we, as a primary American value, said we need a free press to watch our government. Before Amy turns it over to the folks who are listening with questions, I just want to say thank you. I enjoyed that so much.
Thank you. We enjoyed it. You're terrific. Really appreciate it.
Well, you are, like we said, this is the sneak preview of the book. So we're really delighted to have such a wonderful and thoughtful reader.
My pleasure. Thank you. Amy?
Here I am.
Okay.
So now would be the time to put your questions in Q&A if you haven't already. Let's see. So here's a question from Molly Anderson, who says, your thoughts on protests in Russia's Far East and Belarus?
Yeah.
Well, it's an amazing moment. We're kind of distracted in a way by what's happening in our own democracy right now, but we have been paying close attention. So first of all, I think it's 5 weeks in a row you've seen extraordinary crowds in Khabarovsk in the far east of Russia. And, really in some ways, it's the most sustained street protest that you've seen to Vladimir Putin's rule, really certainly in the last few years, at a time when he's just rammed through a referendum that would make him essentially ruler for life. Vladimir Putin, when we got to Russia, was just coming to power, was an unknown middle-aged former KGB lieutenant colonel. Now he's the longest serving leader of Russia since Joseph Stalin. But his popularity, even in a rigged media environment, his popularity has tanked. The economics obviously are not looking good, and the country's response to the coronavirus have been widely panned. Although interestingly, Peter's just got a story today about their announcement that they're going to essentially rush through a vaccine without any of the normal scientific trials. So we'll see, what that does to anything. And then in Belarus, you have, I think, is Lukashenko the longest serving post-Soviet leader at this point? Peter and I actually spent our first wedding anniversary in Minsk, Belarus, covering.
Who wouldn't spend their anniversary in Minsk?
Well, it wasn't our choice, I might add, but
He's just a romantic husband.
Alexander Lukashenko was holding a rigged election to become once again the leader of Belarus on September 9th, 2001. So 2 days before 9/11. And, it was very similar scenes, although now, decades later, you have even more people in the street. And, the point being that these societies haven't had the kind of democracies that they thought they were going to have at the end of the Soviet Union. But that doesn't mean that the desire for freedom or for democracy has been killed off just because they have not had a political system that's given it to them. The bravery is remarkable.
Okay. So there's two questions here that are kind of the same, so I'm going to give them to you both at the same time. Eileen Greenberg asks, is there any Republican in the public eye who you feel mirrors Baker? McCain is gone, Romney, ? Anyone, ? And then William Cohen has a question that says, is there anyone in government today or prospectively that you admire in the way that you admire Baker? So have it that one.
I'm loving these questions, partly because I wish we could see our questioners who we all admire and enjoy spending time with. There's really not anybody quite like Baker today, either Democrat or Republican, I think, who has the same skill set, the ability to cross lines, sort of the capacity that he had in his time. There's no sort of equivalent, I think. Doesn't mean there won't be one again. Time sometimes make the person, right? Make the man. And it may be that there will be a moment in which that will happen. somebody mentioned McCain, I think. I mean, McCain was somebody who at least worked across lines. He didn't let party stand in the way at all times. He had a very strong ideology and a very strong set of principles. But, you know, Baker, I think, was pretty unique, but unique in a lot of different ways. But one way, for instance, we mentioned he ran 5 presidential campaigns. He was also Secretary of State. You cannot think of anybody in public life, frankly, in our lifetime, who did both of those things at that level. Basically, like, say, Karl Rove plus Henry Kissinger rolled into one, or, you know what I mean? Like, these, to be successful at the game of high-level presidential politics and also international statecraft, that's a pretty unusual profile right there.
Yeah, I mean, just quickly, 2 cents, like Romney is an interesting example. The questioner points out, well, is he sort of the heir to John McCain? Certainly he's the closest to it in that people weren't sure what he would do when he got into the Senate, but actually he has been pretty consistently, sort of articulating his concerns. He was the only senator, not just in this proceeding, but actually in American history. He was the only senator to vote to convict a president of his own party in the 3 Senate trials that we've had. So he's shown some of that maverick ability. However, given where the Senate is today and where Congress is today, Mitt Romney's sort of a party of one. So it's not that he's also able to pass legislation or to, kind of create a cadre of Republicans around him. In fact, you haven't seen other Republicans stand up for him, even when Donald Trump has attacked him, even though you think many of them might quietly or privately support him. He hasn't been able to become a focal point or a center of internal resistance.
Let's see. Here's an interesting question about writing biographies. So Peter Englot asks, a constant challenge in writing biography is portraying the subject as an independent actor destined to achieve what he or she did. Are there other directions that James Baker's life might have taken but didn't?
Wow, that's a great question, because it actually gets to part of the story we haven't been able to talk about, but it's really, to us, really probably one of the most compelling elements of his story, which is his own personal life. He's from, as Susan mentioned, Houston aristocracy. His family helped really build modern Houston. He grew up, he's James A. Baker III. He's actually the 4th. He always jokes that they just don't count it correctly. And there was a great pressure on him to follow in the family line. And it wasn't until age 40 that he suddenly gets into politics in a big way. And that's brought about by a family tragedy. And we don't want to give away the entire book, but his wife becomes sick, and it's this searing moment in his life. And who is his best friend who's helping him through this is his pal from the tennis court of Houston Country Club, George H.W. Bush. In fact, the last people to see his first wife alive in the hospital outside of the family were George and Barbara Bush. And that's something that will seal a relationship between 2 people in a way that almost nothing else will, right? That's what a shared tragedy. And I think that became the basis for a complete change in Baker's life. Suddenly, this middle-aged, restless lawyer from Houston is now moving into a whole different arena, thanks to his friend George Bush, who says, you've got to get past this grief. Help me run my Senate campaign in 1970. And it sort of sets him on a whole different path. And that's one of the things that really makes Baker's story interesting, because it's so compelling. There's some private letters we've gotten that have never been published before. We'll leave that to the reader to find out a little bit about. But it's a heartbreaking story and a personal story and a really gripping story, I think, as well.
Well, the point being that he didn't spend his whole life aspiring to be Henry Kissinger, who really worked for decades to find a way into the center of power so that he could act on the world stage. He was in some ways like the world's most successful midlife career switch, essentially. And to the reader's very astute point, yeah, things could have turned out differently. I think that, you look at this and you look at what was able to be accomplished in a very short period of time, and it's pretty clear that a team that was a different team than Bush and Baker might have handled the enormous geopolitical challenges of 1989 to 1991 in a very different way with different outcomes. There were only 9 months to negotiate the reunification of Germany. Boom, right towards the end of that process, Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait. Imagine if they hadn't been able to move quickly and break through the logjam sooner. Mikhail Gorbachev's position in the Soviet Union was deteriorating by the day, and ultimately he would face a coup by hardliners. So it just, history looks a lot neater in hindsight than it did at the time. And so I do think that we came away thinking, wow, it's not just an accident of Jim Baker's life that he ended up in Washington at all, but it could have really changed a lot of very consequential events had he not done so.
So there's a couple of people that are looking for comments about the current election. Jacqueline Taylor asked, what do you think of what James Baker would say about the announcement of Kamala Harris as the VP running mate? And related to that, Lisa Rose asked, if he was campaign manager, how would Baker position Trump-Pence 2020 versus Biden-Harris ticket?
That's interesting, isn't it? The problem is, I think that Baker, I'm sure would say that he thinks Kamala Harris is too liberal. I'm sure he would say that. He is a Republican. And when he gives his explanation for why he votes for Trump, one of the things he says is, I want conservative judges. I want Republicans to be in charge of regulation and deregulating things. So he has a very strong view about these things. And he views most Democrats as too liberal. He does. So I don't think that Kamala Harris would change his mind about it. He might think it was politically smart. But one of the things he learned in 1988 when he was running George Bush's campaign is that the first rule of thumb of any vice presidential pick is do no harm. Right? A vice presidential pick is not necessarily going to win you any votes, but it can cost you. And he saw that up close with Dan Quayle, which is a choice that he didn't make, George Bush did make, and George Bush didn't even talk to Jim Baker about it. One of these moments of stress in their relationship, probably because Bush was trying to assert his independence, didn't like the idea that people thought that Baker was really managing him, and it didn't work out so well. So the lesson that Baker would have taken from that is pick somebody you're not going to have to apologize for or explain. And that's probably, in this case, that's probably what Kamala Harris is. How would he position Trump? The problem is the things he would do, Trump would never accept, right? In 2016, we've got this list that's never been published before of advice that Baker gave Trump in 2016 about how he should position himself for the general election after winning the nomination. None of these things Trump did, right? In effect, he was telling him how to be presidential. And Trump, it's just not in his nature. It's just not in his nature to do the things that Baker would want him to do, which is to say, reach out to people, don't treat people with disrespect, talk up America rather than talking down people. It's out of Trump's wheelhouse to do the things that Baker would have him do.
Well, it's not just that. I mean, yeah, it's a useful thing for Baker to say, essentially, Donald Trump should be not like Donald Trump, but in reality, I think we did come away believing that Baker was a creature of his political moment and not necessarily of this political moment. The truth is that he is an innate deal maker, and we saw that even in his retirement. He would find a way, if he was in that job, or he would find a way to work with Democrats. He would find a way to get things done, and he certainly would not have walked away in the middle of the coronavirus pandemic with people's unemployment benefits having run out and not even any talks on the table. That is not how Jim Baker rolls. And no matter what the ideology was, no matter who was a candidate, he would be saying to him, Mr. President, do your job. And that's the way to get reelected. And so I got to tell you that that's not ideology, and people have deluded themselves to think that it is. The bottom line is that Jim Baker's very strong private advice to Donald Trump, whatever he would say publicly at the age of 90, his private advice would be do your job and help Americans get through this, and then you'll get reelected. Which, by the way, it seems to me would have been pretty good advice for anybody, right?
Okay. How about one last question? We're just coming up on 8 here. Let's see. Eunice Panetta notes that Congress has been losing/conceding power to the executive branch and the judiciary branch for decades. What could reverse that trend?
Boy, good question. Look, this happened in cycles, obviously. After Watergate, there was a reassertion of the congressional role in society. They passed a lot of legislation that restricted the presidential power. Whether that would happen again after Trump, whether it be this year or 4 years from now, I don't know. Remember, Trump's assertion of executive power is not the first time any president's done it. That's a bipartisan thing. Now, he's taken it further than a lot of his predecessors ever would on a lot of things. But the idea that a president would push the envelope is not a new thing. And that, in fact, certainly President Obama did that on a number of instances as well. And we have not seen Congress successfully push back in the modern era. And it's hard because the president commands the bullhorn and commands the bully pulpit in a fragmented media environment with social media and a million channels to watch. The only single person that we pay attention to in society is the president. And that's a power that is really hard for any Congress to counter. And I think that will be a challenge regardless of who's president coming forward, because the speed and the intensity of the job are suited more toward a single executive than they are toward a diffused body of 535 people who cannot agree with each other and don't move very quickly, even when they need to.
Let's finish on a question that's a little bit lighter. Holly Wilson asks, I assume she means Baker when she says, does he still keep a bottle of Chivas Regal in his desk drawer?
That's a great question. Yeah, Baker was a Mad Men era kind of guy on some level, right? That was the generation. He kept that in there. He had an aide who told us, when they would travel, he kind of had a body sense of humor. He would travel and he'd wake up after the morning. He said, "Did you get laid last night?" And the aide told us, he said he would want an answer, right? But even into his retirement years, he's still a little bit of a rascal that way. When George H.W. Bush was in the hospital, he snuck in a bottle. What did he sneak in? It wasn't Chivas. Yeah, like a bottle of vodka that Bush wanted, and the doctors told him he couldn't have. What was it?
Grey Goose.
Grey Goose, you're right, exactly. Good memory, thank you. You know our book better than we do. And he snuck it in the hospital. The doctors are like, what are we gonna do? Well, this is the former Secretary of State, you can't really stop him. So, yeah, he still has a bit of a character on that. I don't think he's as prolific imbiber as he once was. Nobody is at that age, but he's doing well. He's at the ranch in Wyoming with his wife sitting out the coronavirus at the moment, and I think that he's just as happy not to be in Washington.
Well, that's right. I mean, look, he was a shapeshifter, and one of the remarkable things is that there are very few people not only who can be a Karl Rove and then a Henry Kissinger, but who could be fluent in Texas and in Princeton and in Washington. And he had that ability to move fluently among different worlds, which of course is great training for a diplomat, even if he wasn't sitting around reading theories of international relations. His subject was, people and how to maneuver them, how to organize them, how to get what he wanted from them. And that's a pretty good training for somebody who ended up having basically a unique run in the top jobs in Washington and in the United States at this particularly consequential moment in time. So for us, it was really a masterclass in observing that. And so I think and hope that it was helpful for us as we thought about how politics isn't really working in Washington today, to sort of spend some time studying somebody who operated at its highest levels at a different era.
Yes, and it was 7 years in the making. So
well, a few detours along the way.
But it's out on September 29th. You can order it today. It'll be in the two bookstores here in Nantucket. It'll
be at the library.
It'll be at the library. So please take a read.
And if I can make a final comment, James Baker was a fascinating man, and this is a wonderful book. Absolutely, you have hit the bullseye.
Thank you so
Wow.
much.
Thank you for having us back. And,
Such a great treat.
Always afraid that you would ban me after, my 2015 lecture in which we discussed Donald Trump's presidential prospects. So I'm not doing any predictions for this fall, but thank you again for having us.
We love having you. You are welcome back anytime you'd like.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Any final thoughts? Or
No,
some-
we want to wish everybody out there a great rest of the summer and stay healthy. These are trying times, but I'm glad we could share this evening together. It's a great treat for us. And Peter, you were fabulous. Amy, thank you as always. You're wonderful. The whole team there you guys do a fantastic set of programs, and we're privileged to be a small part of it.
Well, I hope we see you again soon.
Absolutely.
So long.
Bye, guys.
Fun.
Bye.